The ENTP, let's be honest, this is one of the most misunderstood out of all of the 16 personality types. And of course, plenty of people receive this type result from online tests, but this does not mean they are actually an ENTP. It does not mean they have the adjoining cognitive functions of this type. So just as with my 5 signs you're not an INFJ video, I'm not going to be applying the dichotomies to this one either. Because these 4 dichotomies, this extroversion versus introversion, intuition versus sensing, thinking versus feeling, judging versus perceiving, well, this entire paradigm is a reason why so many people mistype in the first place. So let's first consider this judging dichotomy in relation to ENTPs. Well, actually, many ENTPs are highly systematic. Many ENTPs are highly goal-driven and even perfectionistic. And what's quite amusing is it's often ENTJs, this supposed commander type, who receives an ENTP score, because as goal-oriented as the ENTJ might be, they are so oftentimes less systematic than ENTPs. And the goals of the ENTP are often more perfectionistic than the ENTJ in the first place. But it is actually the thinking versus feeling dichotomy that throws so many ENTPs off their true type. Because so many ENTPs, and I mean it, so many ENTPs favour their feeling, their oftentimes hypersensitive, extroverted feeling function, over an entirely more detached and cerebral perspective. And being so oftentimes emotionally intense and sensitive to the emotions of other people, it's little surprise that ENTPs oftentimes receive an INFJ score or an ENFP score rather than an ENTP score. And then we get to the intuitive versus sensing dichotomy. And yeah, fair enough, many ENTPs, I'd say the vast majority of ENTPs would be much more likely to receive an intuitive result. However, there are plenty of ESTPs, ISFPs, who think themselves an ENTP. People of these respective types who are in every way, shape and form more intuitive than they are sensing. And let's be honest, many of the people who gravitate towards online tests, irrespective of their actual cognitive functions, tend to be of a more abstract and big picture inclination anyway. And thus using the intuitive versus sensing dichotomy to help you tell whether or not you are truly an ENTP is not going to help the many sensing types who think they are in fact intuitives. And to be honest, I don't think this dichotomy is particularly helpful in allowing people to discover their true cognitive functions. And now we get to the extroversion versus introversion dichotomy. And yeah, we can actually run with this. But I'm not going to be defining extroversion in the contemporary behavioral sense. Because particularly in regards to ENTPs, many people of this type exhibit more stereotypically introverted traits than they do extroverted ones. For example, many ENTPs like to have plenty of alone time. Plenty of ENTPs feel deep down that they don't truly fit in. Plenty of ENTPs only feel truly themselves when they are alone. And despite what is so oftentimes a high degree of social proficiency, many ENTPs suffer with a deep fear that nobody truly understands them. However, in terms of cognition itself, the ENTP is still very much an extrovert. And this is because their cognition, yes, cognition, not behavior, is much more reactive than it is proactive. ENTPs are most fulfilled and energetic when they are reacting to the external world. And this does not mean they are the life and soul of a party. This does not mean that they need to spend a prolonged amount of time in high stimulation environments. But what it does mean is the ENTP tends to spend a lot more time interacting with their external world than they do their internal one. And a major reason why the ENTP often craves at least a certain amount of solitude is so that they have time to focus on their hobbies, to learn new skills, to go down a rabbit hole of research. Because it is when they are left to their own devices that they can be, in many ways, truly extroverted. Because typically an ENTP values their hobbies, they value their creative output, and they value acquiring knowledge about the subjects they are interested in, especially when that subject can enhance their own social utility. So if you tend to spend prolonged amounts of time just entirely in your own head, not necessarily interacting with the external world around you, existing outside of a extroverted intuitive contingency whereby one step in the external world, one reaction against it leads naturally to another one, it is very unlikely you are an ENTP, because the ENTP is a cognitively reactive individual. And being a convergent extroverted intuitive, whether they are employing their convergent auxiliary of extroverted feeling or dipping into their divergent auxiliary of extroverted thinking in order to acquire new knowledge and understand new systems, the ENTP is at their most fulfilled when they can react against emerging concepts in external reality. And oftentimes this type has a high thirst for knowledge and enjoys nothing more than tinkering with their skill sets and perfecting them, particularly when these skill sets again have a social application. And this does not mean an ENTP does not spend times in a proactive state. It just means the majority of the time will be much more reactive in nature. So again, if you are an individual who spends much more time in your own head thinking about doing things rather than actually doing them, much preferring ideas to just bounce around inside your own head, absent any kind of interaction with the external world, be it a physical medium or a book or a person, it is again unlikely you are an ENTP. And relative to the degree to which an ENTP has really come to terms with and nurtured their convergent auxiliary, the type will oftentimes be even more fulfilled when they are cognitively reacting to other people in the social atmosphere. Because at their most fulfilled and confident, this is a highly, highly sociable type. However, when in a social environment, the ENTP is oftentimes not merely reacting against it, but actively anticipating the next step. Because extroverted intuition and extroverted feeling is an emotionally predictive codec lens duo. Many ENTPs, especially those with a fully activated convergent auxiliary, take pride in a certain emotionally predictive capability. It is not entirely unheard of for an ENTP to perceive another person as a kind of emotional sounding board, because they know as soon as they say one thing, it will lead naturally to a certain designated emotional response. And as such, many ENTPs spend time not only observing a social atmosphere, but also interacting with it, cognitively reacting against it, in order to ensure the most desirable social outcome. However, this is not a codec dominant type. This is not an extroverted feeling dominant, and therefore the most desirable outcome is often from a more experiential perspective relating to the perceiver, the ENTP in this case. And as such, the emotional responses of other people often take you off guard, surprise you. And if you often prefer to engage social situations in a more behaviourally speaking reactive sense, going with the flow of the social experience rather than actively trying to anticipate it, you are very unlikely to be an ENTP, because this is one of the most naturally apt, out of all of the 16 types, at predicting the emotions of others. And somewhat ironically, this is a major reason for so many ENTPs mistyping as INFJs, because contemporary descriptions of INFJs tend to emphasize an emotional predictive capability, when in reality so many INFJs lack that intuitive, non-internalized predictive capability. However, the ENTP does not solely observe the social atmosphere, they interact with it. Which brings me neatly to my third point. ENTPs are convergent extroverted feelers, and therefore they take responsibility for the emotions of others. A major difference between the INTP and the ENTP is that it is not enough for the ENTP to simply observe a social situation. The ENTP must interact with it and ideally play an important role within that particular scenario. Extroverted intuition connected to a convergent auxiliary of extroverted feeling takes the entire social atmosphere in its stride. It forms emotional associative patterns and then plays upon those patterns. So oftentimes an ENTP will be playing upon a social atmosphere much like a musical instrument, because they intuitively know and feel if they hit this particular note within this particular key, it would provide more consonance to the motif than if they hit another. But being an individual with introverted thinking in the divergent auxiliary, they oftentimes framework their socializing. And indeed, oftentimes their socializing, their etiquette, if you like, will be under a certain kind of motif. And even if they do not feel necessarily that consistent in their own internal character, and while they will very much indeed mold themselves to various different subcultures and wear masks when appropriate, the social skill set itself remains fairly consistent. And when I say taking responsibility for the emotions of another, I'm not necessarily portraying this in an altruistic sense. Because yes, while the vast majority of ENTPs are kind, loving individuals who very much seek to benefit the social atmosphere not only for themselves but for other people as well, and will oftentimes go out of the way and put a lot of emotional effort into cheering another person up when they're down, an ENTP going through a darker period in their lives oftentimes has the ability to play upon the emotions of another person in a more negative sense. However, it is often a mistake for an ENTP to do this because it often induces, albeit oftentimes an unconscious form of, anxiety. Because the ENTP is predictive in nature and therefore they need to be able to rely upon the continual anticipation of favourable social experience. They cannot do this if they think they are somebody's enemy. And as such, if you gravitate more naturally towards the role of a social bystander, an observer of people, and can even easily remove yourself from any given social situation without an undue amount of effort, it is very unlikely you are an ENTP, because even the most introverted ENTP feels oftentimes most fulfilled when positively enhancing a social atmosphere. And while ENTPs, just like many, many people, do tend to favour one-on-one social situation, owing to the extroverted intuitive nature of their extroverted feeling, they can often handle a group situation better than others. And again, pertaining to the extroverted feeling of this type, because it is so oftentimes powerful and unique to this particular individual, the ENTP's emotionally predictive nature, considered alongside a relatively unconscious sense of introverted feeling value, practically necessitates a continuous supply of extroverted feeling affirmation. And yes, while some ENTPs will become overly addicted to this particular affirmation, even develop a kind of social anxiety that relies upon a continuous supply of this affirmation, many ENTPs, I'd say even the majority of ENTPs, who happen to be less attention-seeking and altogether more balanced individuals, have a much more healthy relationship with this need for overtly expressed social reassurance. But almost across the board, ENTPs need to know they're doing right by others. They need to know they're on good terms with people. And while some ENTPs can indeed be fairly antagonistic within a more virtual medium, in the raw, tangible, extroverted feeling reality, the vast majority of ENTPs need a certain assurance that every situation they're going into is going to be socially harmonious, or at the very least a social situation they are able to control and navigate. And as such, within the confines of reality, an ENTP will often feel extremely anxious if there is bad blood between them and an everyday acquaintance, especially if this is one of their closer relationships. And this is actually one of those rare instances where the ENTP and the INFJ actually cognitively overlap, because for differing reasons, each of these types are much more emotionally healthy when on good terms, emotionally speaking, with the people in their immediate vicinity. And yes, while this can be applied to every single individual, of course it can, the ENTP, being a convergent extroverted feeler, will more actively go out of their way in order to acquire such social reassurance. They not only need to be within, but actively shaping and constructing a positive emotional experience. Because without social affirmation, this type will be in a loop whereby they are constantly predicting and anticipating negative emotional stimuli. They are literally living a negative social situation over and over again before it has even happened. And many ENTPs who have mistyped as INFJs tend to describe this introverted, intuitive, introverted thinking loop that tends to circulate the blogs these days as what is in reality extroverted intuition and extroverted feeling anticipating a social scenario. And as such, while even the most detached and even aggressively individualistic individual is still going to need a degree of social affirmation, being as we are tribal creatures, it is the ENTP who often needs a bucket load. And as such, if you would consider yourself a person who needs less social affirmation than other people do, and perhaps even feel a kind of confusion when you see an individual going out of their way in order to please others, in order to enhance a social atmosphere, it is quite unlikely you are an ENTP. Because even the most convergent auxiliary deactivated ENTP, who does not necessarily relate that much to their extroverted feeling, still needs a fairly consistent supply of healthy emotional feedback. And so oftentimes this emotional feedback can actually make up for the ENTP's natural insecurity as to their own introverted feeling identity. Which brings me neatly to point number 5. Because with the exception of highly individuated ENTPs, the vast majority of ENTPs have a highly unconscious introverted feeling. And this is because the pull of their authority function, introverted thinking, is so strong, coupled with a sensitivity to the extroverted feeling atmosphere, it is indeed rather difficult to activate what is in reality the opposing end of each of these continuums. Because introverted feeling is a natural opposite of introverted thinking, just as it is the opposite orientation of extroverted feeling. And therefore, even when the ENTP's limbic energy is not being called outwards by other people, they are in the majority of these instances engaged with their introverted thinking authority function, refining new skill sets, exploring new hobbies, jumping from one interest to the next one. And as such, most ENTPs spend so much time absent in introverted feeling dialogue, it becomes increasingly difficult for this type to become deeply in touch with the limbic sense of who they are. And oftentimes this type will define themselves more by what they can do and what they can bring to the social table, what other people may even say they are, than what they feel deep inside. But just because the introverted feeling is not conscious, it does not mean it is not powerful. Oftentimes, ENTPs are highly empathetic. Oftentimes, ENTPs are highly sympathetic. And indeed, as much as ENTPs claim to be, owing to that, again, unconscious introverted feeling, hyperlogical, hyper-rational, hyper-detached from their emotions, they so oftentimes have an extremely strong sense of altruism and morality. However, because they are not necessarily conscious of these values, it is not entirely unheard of for the ENTP to not be aware of what values they have until those values are breached in their vicinity. So yes, the ENTPs have values just like everybody else. You could even argue again, owing to that convergent extroverted feelers, the type is naturally more altruistic than other types. They're not necessarily consciously aware of their altruism. And they tend to be even less aware of their core identity, a deeper sense of who they are. And this is why ENTPs oftentimes struggle with a sense of authenticity, because as they mold themselves around the expectations of others in order to secure favourable social experience, they can lose sight of their limbic constant. They can lose sight of their internal, deeply held identity. And again, this does not mean that ENTP does not have a strong and stable identity, but it does mean they can often feel like they are bending with the wind. And as such, if you consciously know exactly what your boundaries are, exactly what your values are, and if you can limbically, emotionally hold on to the core of who you are, while perhaps feeling more confused as to your objective identity more than your subjective one, which is a major reason why INFPs and ISFPs tend to struggle finding their type, by the way, you are very unlikely to be an ENTP. Bonus point, and if you are still with me so far, thank you, you are awesome. ENTPs tend to have a highly compartmentalized, introverted thinking. This means ENTPs can often entertain multiple hobbies alongside each other without feeling a deep need to synthesize and agglomerate all of these different interests and hobbies together. With a highly concrete and focused introverted sensing lens perceiving as it is their introverted thinking authority function, these highly divergent functions of the ENTP, and thus functions they are more observant of, allow the ENTP to fit all of their different interests and areas of understanding within separate, neat little containers. And while being an intuitive type with a fair degree of introverted intuition, oftentimes the ENTP will desire to synergize all of these areas of interest to allow them to mutually complement one another. But because of this highly compartmentalized divergent stack, when they do attempt to do so, it would not necessarily be as seamless as, say, those efforts of an INFJ. And more oftentimes than not, absent this particular introverted intuitive agenda, just as with an INTJ, so long as all of the various different areas of interests correspond to their identity and synergize with who they are, they do not necessarily need all of these different areas to mutually, again, inform one another. And while I will, of course, abstain from the usual ADHD extroverted intuitive stereotype, it is certainly not uncommon for an ENTP to be pursuing one thing one week and another thing the next, while having little need to try and combine all of these areas of interests together. So if you have some level of difficulty perhaps jumping from one hobby to the next, if you feel an intense need to take all of the objective data from within your brain and decompartmentalize it, to allow all of these various atoms, if you like, of data to continuously interact with one another on a more introverted intuitive scale, it is very unlikely you are an ENTP. Because the ENTP is an introverted sensing, introverted thinker. And with these functions being oftentimes more divergent and thus more passive and observational than they are convergent, and of course attitudes can fluctuate, but this is the primary predisposition, the ENTP will oftentimes not only have little need to try and combine all of these areas of interests together, but may actually experience some level of difficulty when trying to take these different areas out of their respective boxes. Of course, not entirely unheard of, but that should give you an additional indicator of whether or not you are an ENTP. So many people have requested, after my 5 signs you're not an INFJ video, another video in this format, so I hope it didn't disappoint people. If you did enjoy the video, be sure to let me know by leaving a comment below and hitting that like button. And if you haven't already done so, be sure to hit that subscribe button down below too with the bell icon next to it, that way you can stay notified of future content. If you are interested in exploring more of the underlying theory used in this video, I definitely recommend you check out the CPT ebook. And I do offer a dedicated CPT type service across multiple tiers for those who are interested in knowing their type or knowing more specifically how their type applies to them. And I also do more general consultations and type coaching too. And finally, if you're interested in supporting the channel and the theory on that additional level, I highly recommend you check out the Patreon page. But it goes without saying, I really appreciate your support over this medium as well. So thank you again for watching, and I'll be back in a few days' time. For now, take care of yourself.